Presidents, fellows and guests, I'm delighted to be here tonight to talk to you about the day Parliament burned down, the 16th of October 1834, a cataclysmic event in late Georgian London, but one that's largely been forgotten. But of course, fellows of the Society have a very long history of research and indeed campaigning for the preservation of the old Palace of Westminster, not least in the notorious row around 1800 conducted by the antiquaries John Carter and Robert Smirke against James Wyatt as he sought to extend the accommodation of the Commons and in the process caused terrible damage to the wall paintings in St Stephen's Chapel. But for most people outside this room, the old Houses of Parliament are completely unknown, and that, I think, is because the new Houses of Parliament, monumental building by Barry and Pugin, has obliterated all memory of what was there before. So I'm going to start off with a guided tour. So this is what Old Palace Yard looked like just before the fire. And what you can see here in the middle is the facade of the House of Lords put on by James Wyatt towards the end of the 18th century. And it's intended to present a castellated Gothic frontage to what had become by then higgledy-piggledy, chaotic mass of buildings built up over the Middle Ages and the early modern period. And it was intended to make the palace, from the riverside at least, look like a country gentleman's residence. This frontage by Wyatt was incredibly unpopular. It was known as the cotton mill at the time. It was also described in the press as a gentleman's lavatory. It wasn't at all popular. On the far right here we have the Sonian parts of the building. John Soane did work at the Old Palace in the 1820s in particular, and he added that entrance on the far right hand side there, the royal entrance, and a suite of buildings for the House of Lords, the new Parliament offices for the House of Lords, and a new library for the House of Lords at the southern end of the palace. And again, this royal entrance was intended to provide a grand ceremonial route through Parliament on a facade that had previously been fairly modest. And then finally, on the left-hand side here, we've got a wing of the House of Commons. These middle rooms here on the first floor are Commons committee rooms. And the top floor is Bellamy's refreshment department. So these are the dining rooms and cafes for MPs. And you can just see behind here at the far end, the southern gable end of Westminster Hall. So that's the southern end, as if you had your back to Millbank. So this is the northern end, as if you had your back to what is today Westminster Tube Station, overlooking New Palace Yard. And one of the most important things to note here is how incredibly close the east end of Westminster Abbey is to the palace. This block here, as many of you will know, is Soane's Law Courts, built in the middle of the 1820s. Previously the Law Courts, of course, had been situated actually inside Westminster Hall. This is one of the key things about the old palace. Obviously, it wasn't just a royal residence from the Middle Ages onwards. It was also the seat of government departments, in particular the Exchequer, which the red-roofed buildings on the left-hand side there, and the law courts situated in Westminster Hall. But they've moved out in the 1820s into that Sonian block on the frontage. Now a look across the cross-section of the palace. This is a well-known plan, a survey taken by Chawner and Rhodes in the Office of Works in August 1834. So this is really the final snapshot of what the old palace looked like. And the plans, which are now at the National Archives, are generally very beautiful floor plans, but there is this one cross-section. And just navigating a little bit around this for you as well. This block here are the committee rooms that I mentioned earlier that we saw in that first slide. Bellamy's refreshment rooms, the kitchens up here and the attics where the Bellamy family lived. This is the members' entrance here. Very, very modest, dark, pokey entrance, nothing ceremonial about it. Members had to come up through the staircase, go across, down, up, and get into the Commons chamber, which is here. And you can see that the floor levels have changed over the centuries. It's become completely chaotic. And with all the additions to the palace, extra committee rooms, pubs stuck on the outside and then taken off again, the whole thing had become a tinderbox. This block here, as you can see, was once the medieval chapel of St Stephen's, very obviously, but at the end of the 17th century, Wren, who was then Master of the King's Works, put in this ceiling here and the floor. Women in 1834 were allowed to watch proceedings of Parliament, but only if they were in the attic, away from the men, and they would peer down. Oh, where's the cursor gone? They would peer down through this octagon here. They could just see the MP's feet looking down through these little windows. And you can see that the chamber itself has become a small box. As it's the 200th anniversary of the death of Spencer Perceval, I think I also ought to point out this year that this is the lobby of the House of Commons here, and that is the fireplace beside which John Bellingham, the assassin of the Prime Minister, was seated waiting for Spencer Perceval. So the only assassination of a British Prime Minister in 1812. I should perhaps say the only assassination so far. That's the cross-section across the old palace. This is what the interior of the House of Commons looked like just before the fire. Incredibly cramped, wood panelling put in by Wren. It's very sweaty, it's disgusting during debates, the air stinks, it becomes horribly hot. And there have been complaints about the accommodation for MPs, really ever since they occupied the Chapel of St Stephen's in the middle of the 16th century. But things really reach ahead in the 1790s and then again at the beginning of the 1830s. And there are two major debates, 1831 and 1833, where Joseph Hume, the Radical MP, who survives on a diet of pears during debates, puts forward two motions to move out of Parliament or to improve the accommodation, or just for Parliament to consider what should happen to the House of Commons chamber. And there are various plans. Should they burst through that far wall by the river and extend outwards, or should they move out completely? Should they move to St James's, which is quite trendy at the time? Westminster is very unfashionable. Or should they move, in fact, to Regent's Park, even more trendy since the zoo set up there? The two motions fail in 1831 and 1833, but on the night of the fire in 1834, a wag in the crowd was heard to say, "Mr. Hume's motion for a new house is carried without division." So what caused the fire? Well, a number of you will already know this, but these are tally sticks, and these are the initial culprits, let's put it like that. Tally sticks are a form of medieval receipt, and one of the reasons I got interested in the fire was because when I was at the Public Record Office in the 1990s, I actually ended up cataloguing a collection of tally sticks. Then I forgot all about it, and then I turned up at Parliament in 1999, and they suddenly came to the front of my mind again. If you were a sheriff in the Middle Ages, you would go to the Exchequer at Westminster twice a year, once at Michaelmas and once at Easter, and you would present there the money that you had been ordered to collect in taxes from your shire. And the tally cutter in the receipt, the Exchequer of receipt, would take a wooden stick about 6 inches long, made of willow or box or hazel, shape it on four sides, put notches in, which you can see here, which indicate the amount paid in, and they'd also write on the side of the tally stick the amount and who'd paid it in. Then they would split it vertically down the middle through the notches, and the sheriff would take away one half and the Exchequer would keep the other half. And what that meant was the sheriff wasn't then able to come back 6 months later and claim that he paid in more money the previous time round than he actually had, and the Exchequer had proof of exactly how much of the money had been collected on an ongoing basis. So that's what tally sticks are. This is a system that was invented in the 12th century, but it was only abolished by statute in 1783, rather astonishingly. But because of the sinecure system in Parliament and the rest of the public service at the time, tallies carried on being cut up until 1826, because it was only then that the final official of the tally office, who had a sinecure post, died. And so in fact, this obsolete system carried on for another 40 years or so. And it was the tally sticks that had accumulated in the Exchequer of Receipt buildings, in those red roof buildings, that were responsible for the fire. At the beginning of October 1834, a new court of bankruptcy was required. There wasn't room in the law courts building, so a space had to be cleared in the Exchequer buildings. And 2 rooms which were full of tally sticks, not very old, they weren't tally sticks going back to the Middle Ages because the collections of tally sticks had been destroyed on a regular basis over the years, given away to palace servants, given away to Exchequer servants. Maybe the last few decades worth of tally sticks were actually stored still in the Exchequer. It was decided that the rooms containing them were to be cleared and the tally sticks had to be got rid of. On the 14th of October 1834, Richard Webley, the Clerk of Works at the Palace of Westminster, decided that the best thing to do would be to burn them in a huge bonfire in New Palace Yard, which you can see here. Then he slept on the decision, and the following morning, the 15th of October, he decided that that was going to cause too much annoyance to the neighbours. So he then decided to do something that caused even more annoyance to the neighbours in the end, and that was to instruct 2 labourers to burn the tally sticks, which were probably about two very large horse carts worth of tally sticks, in the furnaces under the old House of Lords chamber. This is a ground floor plan of what the palace looked like in 1834. And the buildings we've just seen are here, and the furnaces are these 2 bays here in the ground floor undercroft of the Lord's chamber. The Lord's chamber is on the 1st floor, but there is a cellar underneath, the ground floor cellar, and the first 2 bays of the cellar contain furnaces. They're coal furnaces, and they have flues that run up through the walls and exhaust out through chimneys in the roof. And they provide a form of underfloor heating for the House of Lords. At dawn on the 16th of October 1834, 2 labourers turn up. They start burning the tally sticks in those 2 furnaces. And at the public inquiry that followed the fire, they swore blind that they had only put on a few sticks at a time, that they'd watched the fire and made sure it was only a few inches high. They'd scraped out the hot ash on a regular basis. They'd damped down the sticks in a pail of water before they put them into the furnace mouths. But something must have been going wrong really quite early on, because there were signs throughout the day that the flues were starting to collapse. The lining of the flues, which was copper, had begun to melt, and there was a risk of fire. There was smoke seen in the chamber early on in the morning, but it was only about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when the deputy housekeeper was showing 2 gentlemen tourists from Devon around the chamber that things really started to become noticeable. And the 2 gentlemen tourists had gone up to the throne at the far end, which you can see there, and they'd knocked about and had a look at it. But they were actually very disappointed because they had come to London specifically to visit the Palace of Westminster and to see the Armada tapestries which were on the walls, and you can see them here. They're actually inaccurate, these faded watercolours of the Armada tapestry, because this watercolour was actually painted following the fire, so it's the artist's impression of what the paintings would have looked like. For those of you who are familiar with the Armada tapestries, of course, they didn't look like this. They're actually a bird's eye view of what was going on at the Armada, but that's beside the point. The point is that for the 2 tourists, they were very disappointed because they couldn't see the tapestries because there was so much smoke in the chamber. They pointed this out to the housekeeper, and she brushed their concerns aside. They then went over to the bottom right-hand corner here to Blackrod's box. Blackrod, the Queen's representative in the palace, who sat in that pew-type area during sittings of the House of Lords. Parliament is on recess at the moment, so this is why the tourists are able to go around. But that curtained area was quite attractive to them. They went over to have a look, and as they approached, they feel a strange sensation through their feet. They can feel the heat rising up through their boots. And they ask the housekeeper what's going on, and she says, don't worry about it, there are just some men downstairs burning tally sticks. She takes them on to another part of the palace, the painted chamber, which of course has been studied in detail by our fellow Paul Binsky, which is beyond the throne area in a different part of the building. In actual fact, the housekeeper was a rather elevated woman called Frances Brandish, who held the post as a sinecure. She wasn't on site at all at Westminster. In fact, there's no evidence that she ever came to Westminster. She simply took the money and delegated the job to the deputy housekeeper, who was called Jane Julia Wright. Jane Julia was out of the building on the day of the fire, and she had left her mother-in-law in charge. So it was the mother-in-law who was showing the tourists around. And it's clear from the public inquiry afterwards, again, where Mrs. Wright gets questioned in a lot of detail, that she's really not got a grip on the situation. Her answers are extremely odd, and the kindest interpretation is that she's a bit forgetful, and really everything goes downhill from there on. And I suppose the point to say about the housekeeping is that because they're not getting any wages for being housekeepers, because it is a sinecure post, they're entirely dependent on the tips given to them by tourists who are coming to look round the House of Lords for their income. So this is why the mother-in-law and indeed presumably the housekeeper, deputy housekeeper, had she been on the premises, would have been much more interested in ensuring that the tourists had a good time than worrying about health and safety underground. The workmen knock off work about 4 o'clock. They go off to have a pint of beer at the Star and Garter pub across the road in Abingdon Street. The housekeeper locks up at 5 o'clock and the tourists go home. And then at 6 o'clock, a cleaner comes back from running an errand and she walks through the darkened House of Lords lobby, and she sees a flickering underneath the door into the chamber, and screams out, "Oh good God, the House of Lords is on fire," opens the door and sees that the curtains by Blackrod's box are going up in flames. And what's happened is that there's a fire inside the flue. One of the ironies of the fire, there are many ironies of the fire, but one of the biggest ones is that only a few months before, Parliament had passed the first act banning child chimney sweeps from working. And the chimneys had not been swept. Parliament was only due to meet in about 10 days' time. There must have been some sort of chimney sweep appointment booked, but it hadn't happened yet. And the flues themselves have been compromised by years of being cut open to get a small boy inside the flues to actually do the sweeping. And then when the small boy came out, they would be sort of mortared up again. But this had weakened the flues considerably, and it meant that when there was a lot of tar inside, they caught fire, melted the copper and burst out through the compromised brickwork and caught the woodwork above and the curtains and so on. So that's the cause of the fire. So that's how it all happened. But despite the crisis that's going on inside the chamber, palace servants didn't do anything about it, and they didn't raise any alarm to the outside world. They merely ran around like headless chickens, trying to put out the fire and going up onto the roof where the chimney stack was on fire and was starting to become out of control. And it was only at 6:30 that the outside world was alerted to what was going on, because a huge ball of flame burst out of the frontage, Wyatt's frontage here, and up through the chimneys. And that's how the public outside, just promenading past in Old Palace Yard, was first alerted to the fire. And I learnt quite a lot about firefighting theory when I was researching this book. And what seems to have happened was a flashover. For those of you who don't know what a flashover is, it's when the gases from a fire in an enclosed space rise up to the ceiling, get to such a quantity that they then start to fall, and they heat up as they fall all the contents of the room, which then combust as well and create a great rolling ball of fire. And it's clear from eyewitness accounts that this is what happens. And immediately the sky lights up with this huge conflagration. So a bit about actually how the fire was fought. It was the greatest fire in London since 1666. And I believe that it's the most significant fire in London between 1666 and the Blitz. It really was this dramatic, as shown on this slide. It could be seen from the high ground all around London, Highgate, Blackheath, Hampstead. The King and Queen could see it 20 miles away at Windsor. They didn't need to be sent a telegram to tell them that Parliament was on fire. And Charles Barry, the architect of the new palace, saw the fire as he was coming back from Brighton in a stagecoach on the top of the South Downs, and is supposed to have said, "What a chance for an architect." Firefighting arrangements in London in 1834 were manifold. There were, first of all, private fire insurance companies, and there were parish firefighters as well. Each parish had to have a fire engine, but they were quite small, modest machines. The private insurance companies had bigger horse-drawn machines, as you can see here. This is a print just showing a fire in 1830, a domestic fire, but really designed to show the noble protectors of life and property, as it's called, rushing to the scene of the fire. These private firefighting brigades had been in existence since the Great Fire, but by the early 1830s they were starting to collapse. The whole economic model that they were based on wasn't working anymore. And so in 1833 they consolidated together to create a single, or more or less single, private consolidated fire brigade for London called the London Fire Engine Establishment. One or two insurance companies did stay outside the arrangement, but 10 of them clubbed together in 1833. They were led by this man, James Braidwood, a Scot who had been in charge of the Edinburgh Fire Brigade since 1824, and he was headhunted in 1833 to lead the new LFEE. So the parish engines arrived very quickly on the scene, about 20 to 7. Private insurance company engines that are outside the LFEE start to arrive gradually towards 7. But it's only with the arrival of the London Fire Engine Establishment at 7:30, they've received the call at 7 o'clock at their headquarters in London, that things start to improve for the palace. And James Braidwood arrives and he sees that most of the House of Lords is now beyond hope. He arrives just as the roof of the House of Lords collapses. And he draws an imaginary line across the palace. Anything north of it, including Westminster Hall, he'll try and save with all the facilities at his disposal. Anything south of it is probably going to be left to perish. So how do you fight fires in 1834? You use a horse-drawn fire engine like this. This is the nearest one that I could find to 1834 from Sandwich, as you can see, not from London. There are water pipes running underneath the streets, and when a fire alarm is raised, a turncock from the local water company will come out, pull out the street plug or fire hydrant, turn it, and a gush of water will come out, and that is then dammed, and the fire engine hoses are placed into that gushing dam, and an inlet hose comes from the fire hydrant into an inlet point here, into the mechanism, the tank and the mechanism here in the centre of the engine. And there's an outlet hose here and a fireman at the end of the outlet hose. Now, how do they suck up the water from the fire plug and out again? They use a pumping mechanism using these paddles on either side of the engine. And at the moment in this slide they're folded over like this, but they do actually fold it out. And each side of the paddles, there are probably about 8 or 10 men on either side of these paddles, pumping the mechanism, drawing the water through and then shooting it out through the hose. The point about the men pumping is that they're volunteers from the crowd. They're not the firemen. The firemen are there to direct the hoses and to save property. They're not there to do the incredibly hard manual work of doing the pumping, which can only be done for about 5 minutes at a time. And relays of volunteers go in and out of the pumping. And once they've done an hour, each volunteer will be given a token to exchange for a pint of beer at the end of an hour. And I do attempt in my book to calculate how many pints of beer were drunk on the evening based on the compensation claims by local publicans to the Office of Works and the fire brigade subsequently. So some pictures of the fire, and many of these come from the Parliamentary Works of Art collection, which has an incredibly rich array of pictures of the fire and the damage and the ruins afterwards. But this print actually comes from my own collection, and I've not seen it anywhere else. And it's obviously a very crude engraving, but it shows you what's going on fairly on with the fire. The whole frontage of the Lords has caught alight very, very quickly because it's just a facade made of oilcloth and a lot of wood. The fire has spread rapidly, and it's now engulfing all the way up to the Sonian end of the building. And Old Palace Yard has been cleared by the police and soldiers because the authorities were very worried that in fact this was the first strike in some sort of national insurrection. They weren't sure if something else dreadful was going to happen, so the powers of the authorities were out in force on the night. So the same view, but by a much better artist, William Heath. I love this picture. I think it's incredibly dramatic, and as a documentary source it's also great, because what you can see is the strong southwesterly wind driving the flames across the palace, and this is one of the phenomena on the night, that the wind sort of directed the course of the fire, and if it had changed direction at all towards Westminster Abbey, then the Abbey would probably have perished. And in particular, you need to remember that just here, between this residential house and Henry VII Chapel, just behind here is the chapter house, and that, as you will know from the recent publication by the Society, was a repository for public records, including Domesday Book. So Domesday Book was very, very close to the fire on the night. What else can you see here? You can see householders hanging out of their windows to get a better view. We know that rich people were paying householders to get a ringside seat on the balconies to view the fire. The huge crowds which clogged the bridges and clogged the streets, preventing people getting close to the fire after about half an hour. And the general drama of the scene here. A close-up on the middle part of this engraving shows some interesting aspects. You can see the fire engines in the middle being pumped by the volunteers, the street plug here gushing out. There's a fireman here with a little axe who's probably going to be going off to smash open a window to get some valuables out. And we know that, for example, is how the ceremonial maces of the House of Commons were saved. Several firemen and a volunteer climbed up 4 floors to the Sergeant-at-Arms office to get them out. From my point of view as Parliament's head of archives, this is an interesting aspect. This is a horse-drawn cart drawing away books and papers from the scene. In actual fact, they are probably mainly books or possibly public records stored in the law courts and in the augmentation office, another office of the Exchequer, at the front of the building. The parliamentary records suffered greatly during the fire. The public records were generally okay, even though they were in great peril. But one of the reasons I became interested in the fire in the first place was because when I arrived at the Parliamentary Archives in 1999, I discovered that nearly all of the House of Commons records had been destroyed in the fire of 1834, and only the journals, pretty much, of the House of Commons had survived. The House of Lords records were safe because they were stored in the Jewel Tower across the road, and also in the Lords Library, which in the end was unaffected. But the Commons records all perished, and this is why I became interested, because I couldn't find out anything really in any detail about the cause of this fire, and I imagined it must have been a monumental event, which it was, and I couldn't understand why it hadn't been written about. So I started to collect little bits of material here and there over 8 years or so, and then I suddenly realised I'd got enough to write a book, so here we are today. And then finally on this picture, there is a figure here in the middle. I don't know if you can see that figure. Anybody like to hazard a guess as to what that is? Thank you. It's a dog. This is Chance the Firedog, the celebrity fire mascot of the London fire engine establishment. He was a very well-known figure at the time in the papers. If he was around today, he would be on the cover of Hello magazine. He was well known to Dickens, who used him in a parliamentary sketch, satirising an MP who was also seen to be running up and down and barking on the night and making a lot of fuss in the papers afterwards. Chance is wearing a collar that says, "Stop me not, but onward let me jog, for I am Chance, the London fireman's dog." He was adopted by the fire brigade. He'd been a Spitalfields weaver's dog, but he showed a marked inclination to turn up to fires. So they adopted him, and he slept at their headquarters in Watling Street in the city. He died a year after the fire, almost to the day, and they loved him so much that they sent him to a taxidermist to be stuffed. While he was at the taxidermist realised that he got a gold mine on his hands because he was such a celebrity. So he sold him on to a travelling fair where he was on display for a penny a look. And when the firemen found out, they marched off in force to retrieve Chance, and he was put in a glass case and sat in their headquarters at Watling Street until the 1880s in pride of place. And then he was sold off for a fireman's benevolent fund, and there's no trace of him today. But if anybody is rootling around an attic or a junk shop, I would really like to know if you find a Manchester Terrier in a glass case with a collar on, because it would be great to rediscover Chance. And this is a third view of the fire from across Old Palace Yard. You can see the fire plug gushing in the front here. It took me ages to work out what that was. I thought it was a swan. I was going, what's a swan doing coming across the front of the painting? But no. The reason I put this up is because this gives a sense of the absolutely cataclysmic, climactic event that it was, and who better to do that than Turner. For people at the time, it was a terrifying experience. People talked about it being the acme of the sublime, absolutely awestruck crowds. Secondary works about the new palace often talk about, in one paragraph, the fire, and they often say things like, the crowd at the fire stood around clapping and cheering. The actual evidence is that although there were one or two cheers and a little bit of clapping, in actual fact, people were clapping because it was a cinematic experience. It was completely outside their normal experience of even light shows and fireworks and so on, and they had no other response to it other than to clap. It had become a sort of objectified experience. But it's also true that many people seem to have been psychologically affected greatly by the fire. Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister, had flashbacks about the fire whenever he was depressed. His biographer says, carrying on through his life. And Thomas Phillips, who will be well known to many of you, the antiquarian collector, who was there on the night of the fire, desperately trying to save the public records that were being thrown out of the law courts onto the muddy cobbles below. He then went back to his house subsequently, rearranged all the shelving of his collections, and turned them into coffin-like boxes with drop-down lids so they could be evacuated very, very quickly in the event of a fire at his house, and he became very sort of obsessive-compulsive about it. So it had a huge psychological effect, and it was in the papers for months and months afterwards. So the view across Old Palace Yard, at 8 o'clock the Commons had caught fire and almost immediately collapsed, and Pugin gives us an eyewitness account of the fire catching hold of the Commons, and within 6 or 7 minutes it has got onto the roof and collapsed the roof, and the Commons is just there. And this is really just giving you a sense of the direction of the wind and how strong it was. And behind here, on the left-hand side, behind there is Westminster Hall. So the cry goes up from the the Chancellor of the Exchequer, damn the House of Commons, but save, oh save the Hall. So this is Westminster Hall being saved, probably around 10 o'clock in the evening. There's scaffolding already up in Westminster Hall because repairs are going on by Robert Smirke, and so there are ladders which help the rescue greatly, and you can see people sort of shinning up the ladders on the left-hand side there towards the Speaker's house, which is the cloister area of the old palace. Firemen are also going up there, breaking open the windows, getting onto the roof to try and create a fire break to stop the flames, which you can see at the far end there at the south window, getting onto the roof and then burning through and destroying the hammer beam, fantastic hammer beam roof there. Just a little bit of a close-up on the central part there. You can see a string of engines here. Here's one, there's another one in the distance. The problem is that Westminster Hall is so huge that the hoses from the fire engines aren't long enough to stretch to the far end of it where they're needed. There's a street plug in New Palace Yard, but the fire is at the other end of Westminster Hall. So the engines are joined up in relays to create a sort of string to pump the water through finally to the Great South Window. And that's what you can see happening here. And also you may just be able to make out this figure here. And he's just got a tankard of beer there, which he's raising to his lips, obviously having been volunteering on pumping the engines. Very impressionistic, quick watercolour of Westminster Hall from somebody on Westminster Bridge. What you can see here is sort of floating on a bed of steam almost, huge crowds around it, and the flames licking up the southern end of the roof there, and St Stephen's Chapel in the background there. The firemen were incredibly brave. There were hundreds of volunteers in the hall helping out, and it was partly due to their efforts that Westminster Hall was saved. It was also due to the efforts of 3 named firemen who were identified in the papers, who got out onto the lead flat, which is just here, at the front of the south window, just there, tiny little space there, and with their backs to the south window and surrounded by fire on all other sides, they played the hoses against the flames to stop them breaking through the window and onto the roof. And at least one of them was incredibly badly injured. We don't know what happened to him. He was taken to Westminster Hospital. He may have died, but there's no record. But it's partly due to their efforts, the efforts of the volunteers, and a fortunate change of wind direction at midnight, which blew the wind more southerly towards the river and away from the southern end of Westminster Hall, and the arrival of an important piece of kit on the river that saved Westminster Hall. So let's look at what's going on the river. This is the eastern front, the river front, and it's possible to identify all the buildings here, even though this is a wonderfully naive painting. These are the Parliament offices of the House of Lords, the Painted Chamber there, the Commons Library there, 3-storey Commons Library by Soane, St Stephen's Chapel, Speaker's House with a Wyatt frontage on, and then Westminster Hall at the end. And the other interesting point about this picture is huge crowds on the shoreline. Obviously this is pre-embankment, so there are simply gardens on the eastern side and then a wall and then a shoreline and boats on the river. And it was said that it was possible to pass from the Lambeth side of the river to the Westminster side without touching the water. You could simply jump from boat to boat, so crowded was the river with spectators. But what you can also see there is the river is at low tide, and this is preventing a piece of kit coming upriver which would have saved the eastern flank of the palace if it had arrived earlier. And we can just see it here. This is a woodcut that was in the papers in the days following the fire, and we can just see this boat here, which is in fact the LFEE's great floating engine, a barge-mounted fire engine, which was used for waterside fires. And of course the advantage of this is that there's an unlimited supply of water which the hoses can immediately get at. But it does require the river to be high enough to actually get the barge up from Rotherhithe where it's moored. And this is the first of 2 fantastic oil paintings by Turner. And from a documentary point of view, even though it's a fabulous piece of work, what we can actually see here is the floating engine being towed upriver towards the fire in this picture. And there's just that blow up of the black and white picture again, showing the floating engine in place there, about to start squirting water across the eastern flank of the palace. And you can see there it's still got the word Sunfire on the outside of the barge, the Sunfire Insurance Company being one of the companies that had merged into the LFEE in 1833. It's still got livery on the outside of its barge. So what was the damage? Again, often if you read popular books about the new palace, it says the whole of the old palace was destroyed in the fire. Well, evidently it wasn't, because we all know that Westminster Hall and the crypt chapel and parts of the cloister survive. What really happened in the fire was that the medieval core of the palace was destroyed, as you can see here, the shaded parts. The right-hand side, the Sonian buildings of the Lords and his law courts at the front of Westminster Hall survived, and of course the law courts stayed there until 1880, until they moved to the Strand. So some before and after pictures. This is a very fine charcoal drawing of the House of Commons before, and if you just keep your eyes on the three windows at the far end, we'll see an after. So what you can see there is that the chapel is revealed in all its medieval glory. The wren ceiling and wall, ceiling and floor has fallen in. The wall paintings have been burnt back, and antiquaries raved about this because it was as if the medieval palace was rising like a phoenix from the flames, and all the ghastly, filthy accretions of later centuries had been burnt away. And you can see there sightseers and artists on the ground taking a look at the palace, and we know that over 40 artists did pictures and watercolours and sketches of the ruins. The painted chamber, I mentioned that earlier. This is the view of it in 1799. It had been originally Henry III's bedchamber, ceremonial state bedroom. It was the place where Charles I's death warrant was signed. This view in 1799 shows it with whitewash over all the fantastic wall paintings, and there's a rather random tapestry there as well. But you can see the roof there, the original medieval roof, and one surviving part of the roof is here in the John Soane Museum, one of the wooden patterns there, and also more recently there have been discoveries at the British Museum of paintings, wooden panel paintings that survive. Both of those from the period, I think, when John Soane was doing alterations in the palace, and he took these away as souvenirs. So they're not survivals of the fire. They were actually removed before the fire, and they're really our final relic of the painted chamber. Just before the fire, the wall paintings had been uncovered. They were known to antiquaries, and they've been sketched, and you can just see them here in the window splays very faintly. At a time when this is about 1820, I think, this watercolour, at a time when the building was being used as a court of requests, which was a civil claims court. And that's the view afterwards. So the roof has fallen in, and whatever paintings survived under the whitewash have been burnt away. But you can see those are incredibly sturdy medieval walls. So in fact, this building was re-roofed by Robert Smirke and refurbished with papier-mâché, and turned into a temporary House of Lords up until 1847, when the Lords moved into the new Barry and Pugin chamber. This is a view across the roofs showing the damaged cloister and the damaged St Stephen's Chapel. You can just see there, if we move on, you can just see there a fire crew still fighting the flames. The fire was under control by about 3 o'clock in the morning, but flames started to burst out the day after and carried on bursting out for the next 5 days, after which the fire crews left. But it was very much under control as a result of the arrival of the floating engine by the early hours. And you can just see here in the corner, again, probably some residents of the palace surveying the destruction, and an abandoned fire hose here, and some salvaged pictures from the clerestory. So the morning after, across Old Palace Yard, this is a very rapid charcoal drawing. What may not be evident from this is that it's really showing a shell. It looks fairly complete here, but that whole frontage is a shell, and you can probably just see here there's a fire crew still fighting the flames up on this ladder here, and Bellamy's is just completely blank. All the windows are smashed in and it's completely burnt out. This must have been sketched very early on the following day, because we know that by noon on the Friday, the day after, a hoarding had started to go up to prevent the public from promenading past and being threatened by the collapse of these towers here at the front, which were very rickety and were falling down the whole time. And I do wonder if this little cart here with the little man pulling planks of wood off isn't the start of the hoarding going up. Just a close-up on that facade again. The white facade has completely collapsed, but it's revealed the walls of the lesser hall, the Lord's Chamber, with its Diocletian windows. And again, this building was found after surveying to be sturdy enough to be re-roofed by Smirk, and it became the temporary Commons Chamber up until 1850. And in fact, they moved out into their new chamber, didn't like it, and moved back in again to the temporary chamber, which they got very used to because it was much bigger and more airy and spacious than what they'd been used to before 1834. Charles Barry had to lower the ceiling of his new chamber on the instructions of MPs, which he was very annoyed about, and he never went into the new chamber as a result. The view, again by that same artist, from the riverside, and I'm really just showing you this because you can see the collapsed frontage of the House of Commons Library here, the three-storey Sonian library with oriel windows. The whole of the frontage is collapsed in on itself. And there are some very dramatic descriptions of the destruction of the Commons Library. And the reason for showing it to you is because I think that this must have been one of the principal locations of the Commons records, and that's why they don't survive. Salvage operations occur very, very quickly afterwards. There's just a chap here smoking a pipe in between, dealing with the stonework, that wonderful Gothic doorway there. Nobody died in the fire, but lots of people died during the salvaging work. Walls fell on them, they fell off walls, they strangled themselves on ropes and so on. Then demolition of St Stephen's Chapel. You can just see that in the background. It was incredibly rickety. Some of the plans for the new palace did try to incorporate the shell of St Stephen's, but in fact Barry's plan did away with it completely. And you can just see here on the left-hand side the painted chamber being shored up as part of the re-roofing project. A final snapshot, as it were, of the old palace nestled in there as the new palace rises about it, probably around 1847, I suppose. You can still see the lesser hall in the middle there, and you can see the painted chambers just there. The perspective of this is completely shot to pieces. It's actually part of a much bigger panorama taken on in a balloon of the whole of London. It's really a tiny corner of that, and it's designed to make the new palace look ginormous, and Westminster Hall has disappeared altogether. But you can see, you know, that sense of this much smaller palace about to disappear from view. So finally, what came out of the fire? Well, obviously the new Palace of Westminster, but there were a number of other developments which perhaps you're not quite so familiar with. After the fire, there were immediate calls for there to be a public fire brigade for London rather than a private one, because the arrangements were found to have been so ridiculous that it was thought necessary to have a single public fire brigade. So the calls started in 1834, but in fact they only came to fruition in 1866, after the death of James Braidwood at the Great Tooley Street fire of 1861. The public records, which had been in such danger on the night of the fire, were in the control of the Record Commission, what today we would call a failing government department, which, as a result of a 1,000-page public inquiry afterwards, was closed down, and the Public Records Office Act of 1838 came directly out of this fire. And the Royal Commission, which preceded that, started off its report by saying nobody can now be in any doubt of the danger from fire to our public records. And so the national record keeping system and the national archives that we have today arise directly out of this fire. Two fantastic Turner paintings. This is the second wonderful oil painting. Both of them are now in America. They left the country in the 19th century. Dickens uses fire in all of his novels, and I speculate in the book about the influence that the fire might have had on him. And in particular, there is a very dramatic fire in Oliver Twist, which doesn't drive the story forward in any way, but bearing in mind that Dickens was a parliamentary reporter at the time of the fire and was probably filing copy for the Morning Chronicle, although not acknowledged in any bylines at the time, it's very tempting to speculate that this fire in Oliver Twist, which is very similar to the descriptions given by Pugin of the fire, is actually Dickens telling us what it was like to be in the crowd. The weights and measures of the kingdom were melted in the fire, so there was a period after the fire when nobody knew how long a yard was, or how long a mile was, or how heavy a pound was, and there were the first sort of discussions then about decimalisation, which of course, as we know, only really started to come in from 1970, and some haven't even come in yet. So there are also a huge range of effects of the fire beyond the building of the new palace. So that's my pitch to you about why the day Parliament burned down is worth remembering. Thank you.